In September of 2025, a small team of scientists lowered a robot into the second deepest lake in America and switched on a live camera feed. Thousands of people watched their screens as the machine sank past 100 feet, then 500, then 1,000, heading for a place no human eye had ever directly seen. What came back up that afternoon didn't just answer questions people had been asking about Lake Tahoe for a century. It quietly closed the book on some of the most repeated legends in the American West and opened up a set of much stranger, much more documented mysteries in their place. To understand why this dive mattered so much, you first have to understand what Lake Tahoe actually is. It formed roughly 2 million years ago when a section of the Earth's crust dropped between two rising mountain ranges, the Sierra Nevada on one side and the Carson Range on the other. As the block of crust sank, water filled the resulting basin and never stopped. The lake that resulted is enormous by any measure, about 22 miles long, 12 miles wide, sitting more than 6,000 feet above sea level, and holding something in the neighborhood of 39 trillion gallons of water. At its deepest point, near Crystal Bay, the lake floor sits roughly 1,645 feet below the surface. Only Crater Lake in Oregon goes deeper among lakes in the United States. Depth alone wouldn't be enough to build a mythology around. What makes Tahoe different is what happens to the water once you get below about 700 feet. Down there, the temperature holds at a nearly constant temperature in the high 30s Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of the season on the surface. That's close to the point where fresh water reaches its maximum density. The pressure at that depth is intense, oxygen and bacterial activity are limited, and the combination slows the natural process of decomposition to a crawl. Organic material that would break down in weeks in a warm river can remain recognizable for years, sometimes decades, at the bottom of Tahoe. That single fact, verified repeatedly by researchers at institutions like UC Davis, is the seed from which almost every Tahoe legend has grown. The most famous confirmation of that science came not from a research vessel, but from a group of recreational technical divers. In July of 1994, a 44-year-old city planner named Donald Windecker went scuba diving with a partner off Rubicon Point on Tahoe's west shore. Something went wrong as the pair started their ascent, and Windecker sank before his companion could reach him. Search teams looked for days and eventually called it off. The lake was too deep and too cold for a body to be reasonably recovered. For 17 years, he was presumed to be one of the lake's permanent, unrecoverable residents. Then, in the summer of 2011, a diver exploring the area at around 265 feet came across a body resting on an underwater shelf, still dressed in full scuba gear. Authorities used a remotely operated vehicle to bring the remains to the surface, and dental records confirmed what many suspected. It was Windecker. Officials at the time credited the cold water, close to 35 degrees Fahrenheit at that depth, along with the pressure and his wetsuit, for keeping his body remarkably intact after nearly 2 decades underwater. That case is real. It's documented in newspaper archives from the Reno Gazette-Journal to the Los Angeles Times, and it's the reason Tahoe has such a strong reputation as a lake that doesn't give up its dead. But it's also where a lot of internet storytelling goes off the rails. For decades, a persistent legend has circulated claiming the lake floor is littered with the bodies of organized crime victims from the mid-20th century, supposedly weighted down and dumped by the hundreds. Journalists, fact-checking organizations, and professional dive teams have gone looking for evidence of this specific claim repeatedly over the years. None of them have found it. What the science actually shows is that Tahoe can preserve a body extraordinarily well under the right conditions, and one well-documented case proves it. It does not show that the lake floor is secretly a mafia graveyard. If you want proof that the cold really does work the way people say, you don't need rumors. You need the SS Tahoe. She was a 169-foot steamer launched in 1896, built for lumber baron Dwayne Bliss, and for more than 4 decades, she carried passengers and cargo around the lake, earning the nickname Queen of the Lake. When she was retired in the late 1930s, the Bliss family decided not to scrap her. Instead, in August of 1940, she was towed out near Glenbrook and deliberately scuttled, with the intention of sinking her in about 100 feet of water so tour boats could view her from the surface. The plan didn't survive contact with the lake floor. The slope off Glenbrook drops away far more steeply than anyone anticipated, and as the ship filled with water, she slid down that slope and kept sliding, coming to rest with her bow near 360 feet and her stern close to 475 feet down. She sat there untouched for 62 years. In 2002, a team of technical divers using specialized mixed-gas equipment finally reached her. What they found matched every rumor about Tahoe's preserving power. The brass fittings on deck still had a shine to them. The wood paneling inside the cabins hadn't rotted away. Painted lettering on the hull was still legible. By multiple accounts from the divers who made the descent, the ship looked like she'd gone down a few years earlier rather than more than 6 decades before. In 2004, the SS Tahoe became the first maritime site in Nevada listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and she remains down there today, the largest known intact artifact resting on the lake floor. The lake holds other surprises too, and one of the strangest doesn't involve anything man-made at all. During a severe drought in the 1930s, water levels in Tahoe and the nearby Fallen Leaf Lake dropped low enough to expose things that hadn't been seen in millennia: tree stumps, rooted upright exactly where they had grown, along sections of shoreline that are normally underwater. Researchers eventually carbon-dated some of these stumps to thousands of years old. Decades later, at Fallen Leaf Lake, a retired university professor noticed his fishing line kept snagging on something below the surface, which led to a documented survey by researchers, published in a peer-reviewed journal, of an entire underwater forest still standing upright on the lake bed. Some of the trees dated back over 2,000 years. They weren't driftwood that had settled and somehow stood upright. They had grown on dry land, along an ancient shoreline, during a stretch of extreme and prolonged drought known to climate scientists as a medieval megadrought, one that appears to have lasted roughly 2 centuries. When the rains eventually returned and the lakes refilled, the water rose fast enough to drown the forest in place rather than knock it over. It's a genuinely sobering discovery because it means the kind of extended, multi-generational drought that could reshape water availability across the American West isn't hypothetical. It has already happened here within the last 1,000 years or so, and the climate record shows it clearly. Not every hidden layer of Tahoe's history is geological. Between roughly 1870 and 1890, the basin supplied an enormous amount of the timber that fed the silver mines of Nevada's Comstock lode, and much of the labor that cut that timber, tended the log flumes, and built the surrounding infrastructure was performed by Chinese workers. By the 1880s, communities of Chinese laborers lived at sites like Glenbrook on the lake's east shore, and archaeologists working with the U.S. Forest Service have since identified dozens of associated campsites scattered around the basin. That history largely disappeared from public memory, and the reason is uncomfortable. Anti-Chinese violence and organized economic boycotts swept through Sierra Nevada towns during this period, forcing Chinese residents and business owners out of communities where they had lived and worked for years. Some of this history is preserved today at a small library branch near Zephyr Cove, where artifacts from the old labor camps are displayed. There is no credible evidence that any of this displacement involved bodies in the lake, despite occasional claims online. The documented history is different, and in some ways more sobering. An entire community that helped build the region's infrastructure was driven out through coordinated pressure and violence, and largely erased from the story Tahoe tells about itself. Underneath all of this sits a geological hazard that gets far less attention than it probably should. The West Tahoe Fault runs beneath the lake's deepest water, and researchers from institutions including Scripps Institution of Oceanography have studied its rupture history and estimated that it produces a major earthquake roughly every 3,000 to 4,000 years, with the most recent significant event believed to have occurred a few thousand years ago. If a large earthquake ruptures that fault while it's sitting under more than 1,000 feet of water, the result wouldn't just be shaking. It would displace an enormous volume of water almost instantly, generating what researchers have modeled as a substantial tsunami wave capable of reaching shoreline communities within minutes, followed by hours of a sloshing phenomenon called a seiche that would send repeated waves against the shore. The lake bed also carries evidence of an ancient underwater landslide off the west shore, known as the McKinney Bay Slide, believed to have generated a wave that may have reached heights of well over 100 feet in the distant past. None of this is speculation dressed up as fact. It comes from published seismic and geological research on the basin, even though the exact timing of some past events is still debated among scientists. Which brings the story back to that robot descending through the dark in September of 2025. The dive was organized by a nonprofit called the Restoring the Lake Depths Foundation, in partnership with the Tahoe Fund and an engineering firm, using a custom remotely operated vehicle nicknamed Emmy. It carried high-definition cameras and a live uplink, and thousands of people tuned in as it made its way down to roughly 1,570 feet, close to the deepest section of the entire lake. What the cameras showed was, in a strange way, both anticlimactic and genuinely important. There were no bodies. There were no shipwrecks full of secrets, no hidden structures, nothing resembling the decades of internet speculation about what might be waiting in the dark. What the footage actually revealed was a floor of fine, pale sediment, drifting through the ROV's lights like a slow-motion snowstorm, a mix of organic material and fine granite particles eroded from the surrounding mountains over thousands of years. Researchers involved in the project, including a limnologist from the University of Nevada, Reno, explained afterward that this gradual settling of sediment is actually part of what keeps Tahoe's water so famously clear. The dive also turned up something far less mysterious and far more preventable: discarded tires, fishing gear, and other litter, echoes of just how heavily used the lake's surface has been for the past century, even as its depths stayed almost completely untouched. If the bottom of the lake turned out to be mostly empty of mystery, the real unresolved cases in Tahoe's history are still very much on the record, and they're stranger for being true. In September of 1970, a 25-year-old nurse named Donna Lass finished a shift at a casino on the Nevada side of the lake and was never seen again. For decades, her disappearance became one of the region's most talked-about cold cases, and some investigators wondered whether it connected to an unsolved serial murder case active in Northern California at the time, though that link was never proven. In 1986, a skull was discovered in the mountains not far from South Lake Tahoe, and it sat unidentified in evidence storage for decades until modern DNA analysis in late 2023 finally confirmed it belonged to Donna Lass. Her remains had been in the mountains, not the lake, and the identification of her body answered one question while leaving the central one: who is responsible, still completely open. Her case is a reminder that Tahoe's real unsolved mysteries were never really about what was hidden underwater. They were about people who vanished into a vast, rugged region that, even now, is hard to search completely. There's one more layer to this story, and it belongs to the people who understood the lake's dangers long before anyone had the technology to explain them scientifically. The Washoe people have lived in the Tahoe Basin for at least 6,000 years, and in their tradition, the lake was both the most sacred place in their territory and one of the most dangerous. Specific locations, including a site called Cave Rock on the east shore, were treated with deep caution and approached only by healers bringing offerings. Traditional stories describe powerful beings associated with the lake's deep water, sometimes translated loosely as water babies, said to be responsible for sudden drownings and unexplained disappearances near certain parts of the shoreline. For much of the 20th century, outside researchers treated these traditions as folklore rather than knowledge. But the physical reality lines up strikingly well with what's now understood about cold water immersion. When a person falls into water as cold as Tahoe's, even in the middle of summer, an involuntary gasp reflex and rapid loss of muscle coordination can incapacitate a strong swimmer within seconds, long before hypothermia itself becomes the threat. The Washoe didn't have that vocabulary of physiology, but generations of direct observation gave them an accurate map of where and how the lake could kill, encoded in the language available to them at the time. Put all of it together, and the actual story of Lake Tahoe looks nothing like the version that circulates online. The cold water really can preserve a body for decades, but the evidence for that comes from one documented case, not a hidden graveyard. A historic steamship really was swallowed by the lake, and really has stayed remarkably intact for more than 80 years. An entire forest really did grow and drown centuries before anyone was around to photograph it, and it's a warning about drought that modern California can't afford to ignore. A real earthquake fault sits beneath the water, capable of producing a real tsunami, and it's overdue by the standard rhythm of the region's seismic history. And when scientists finally sent a camera all the way to the bottom in 2025, what they found wasn't a monster or a mob dumping ground. It was quiet sediment, litter that shouldn't be there, and confirmation that the deepest mysteries of Tahoe were never really underwater to begin with. They were on the surface the whole time, in the people who disappeared, the communities who were pushed out, and the knowledge that was there for 6,000 years before anyone thought to ask.